simply having a dysfunctional breathing pattern even when you're just sitting around, even when you're asleep, it can put you in a chronically high stress state.
Stress is the inflammation that robs us of life, energy, and happiness. Our typical solutions for gut health and hormone balance have let a lot of us down. We're over-medicated and underserved. At The Less Stressed Life, we're a community of health-savvy women exploring solutions outside of our traditional Western medicine toolbox and training to raise the bar and change our stories. Each week, our hope is that you leave our sessions inspired to learn, grow, and share these stories to raise the bar in your life and home. Today on The Less Stressed Life, I have Jesse Coomer, who's a human performance specialist, breathworker, renowned speaker in the field of breathwork. He trains athletes, CEOs, first responders, military, and everyday people who seek to optimize their performance, reduce anxiety levels, and live a healthier life. He also describes himself as a recovering English professor. So I'll be curious about the transition from one to the other. Welcome, Jesse.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Yes, I am recovering still. I did 11 years. I did 11 years as an English professor, and it was great. But yeah, I'm just focusing on this now.
Yeah.
And it's been a beautiful thing.
Tell me actually about the transition. Why did you move toward breathwork? Was this something you had found for yourself?
It's interesting. So it really all ties in together with how I found breathwork in the first place. So I have always been an extreme extrovert. So you'll always find me wanting to chat, always wanting to connect with other people. But I've also always been someone who's suffered from extreme social anxiety. So it's this combination that growing up, especially, started to manifest in high school and my 20s. I tried to do everything I could to address that anxiety. And of course, not having any tools available, I chose a lot of destructive paths. And it was in the efforts of getting out of a lot of those destructive paths that I chose to go back to grad school. And one thing I loved was I always loved just literature, the philosophy of literature, a lot of the things that everyone's hearing this and is like, oh, okay, I have nothing in common with this person. But I've always really been fascinated by that. And I've always loved to write. And so one of the things that I have found in transformation, and this is something I do a lot in my retreats, I work with clients and just basically helping a person step into the person they want to be, is that a lot of times we focus on what we don't want to be. And we try just to be that, not that, And so something that I kind of fortunately just intuitively went to, and I said, okay, I don't like where I am now. I want to do something that I want to be. I want to be proud of myself for accomplishing some kind of a goal. And so as I was leaving a life of, drug addiction and a lot of negative ways of addressing anxiety, at the very same time, I leaned into the next big adventure. So as to, what I say sometimes is, there's a part of yourself that has to die so a part of you can be born. And I allowed that to be born. And I found out I just really like teaching things. It doesn't have to be English. And I tell you what, if you can actually like teaching grammar and essay writing, I just assume there's pretty much nothing I won't like to teach. So during that time, I was still addressing a lot of my anxiety, and I started doing things to help that, exercise, trying to take better care of myself, seeing just obviously avoiding negative pathways of dealing with stress and anxiety. And it was during the time being a professor that I started to try to meditate, and quickly found that I wasn't a very good meditator. I don't know.
Most people are not.
Yeah, right. And I would just sit down and I couldn't wait for it to be over. But I was really dedicated I really wanted to make this something that worked for me because I knew there was a lot of value in it. And so from there, I was starting to try to find ways to become a better meditator. And that led me to a lot of research that led me to actual breath work being the pathway that would work best for me. And from there, I became the breath worker English professor, which I did both for a long time, for about 6 years. I was the English professor who, okay, this weekend I'm going to lead a retreat, and then I got to come back late Sunday night so I can, teach my, research and rhetoric class on Monday morning. And it just kind of slowly grew into something that it was a real passion for me. And I was even teaching it to my students, especially during the pandemic. When we returned to the classroom, we still had masks, and we still had, and obviously enormous amount of anxiety and stress. So when it was a nice day outside, I would say, hey guys, I tell you what, let's go outside and let's do some breathing techniques. And of course, we all got to see each other's faces. We're like, oh, okay. I had a totally different, you remember that whenever you met a person, the only way you knew them was with a mask, and then they remove. And then it's like, oh, that was nothing like what I had pictured. But we got to know each other in a better way. And so ultimately in 2020, I also published my book on breathwork called A Practical Guide to Breathwork. And it was a really big hit. And I was really pleased. I was very pleased with that. And so before you know it, I had a lot of requests and a lot of demands, and I was doing 2 full-time jobs. And I said, oh my gosh, I can't do this forever. So I had to choose to move to the next thing. I believe, while I do coach people, I have a lot of clients. I see myself still as an educator. I think an educator is the person who's incredibly curious and just can't help himself or herself. It's like, Carl Sagan, he has the quote, when you're in love, you want to tell the world. And I think that's a teacher. It's like, oh my God, I love this thing. I got to tell people.
Yeah.
So it was a smooth transition. I still feel like I'm an educator at heart.
I think that was a good story for anyone seeking a transition. I mean, we talk a lot about health in different capacity, or more of a medical capacity here a lot. And there's a lot of people that have had a lot of burnout these past few years, and they're looking and transitioning and whatever. And what you just described is what a lot of us do. Even when I stopped doing what I was doing before, what I'm doing now, it just kind of, the one edges out the other sometimes, right? You don't have to like stop one and start the other. You just dabble, and then it starts to take over, and then you're kind of tired. And then you just decide to eliminate one, the end.
Yeah.
When it outweighs the other.
There's a lot of advice out there to jump face first into this thing, right? It's like, man, if you got a passion, just quit your job and do that. And I could never do that myself. And ultimately, I didn't know why for the longest time. And actually, this is part of the subject of my next book, which is The Language of Breath. And it's ultimately the philosophy that I have with breath work as a whole, is that your conscious thinking part of you is only a very small sliver. And when you go against the other part, which is that unconscious part of yourself, you're going to struggle in ways that it's going to be so uncomfortable, because you're really fighting yourself. And what happens so often is that a person thinks, oh, I'm weak, or this other person just quit his job and then he did this other thing or whatever. And in reality, that other person had an unconscious belief that was like, yeah, of course I'm going to do that, So for myself, and when I train my clients, especially when it comes to behavioral changes, when it's like, there's a behavior I don't like that I do, and I can't seem to stop doing it. We're always working with our breath, but we're especially focusing on the fact that your unconscious self it has an opinion on what you do, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to make you very uncomfortable if it believes that your conscious actions are in conflict with what's best for you. And maybe I skipped ahead a little bit, but ultimately, that I think that conflict, that inner conflict, is at the crux of much of our suffering.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
It's at the, you know what I mean? And it's this thing that no one talks about, no one knows about. And, I had to be this many years old. It was one of those things that it blew my mind. But we've known this for decades. We've known there is a part of us that it builds patterns. It's very good at seeing patterns in your life. It will form a worldview, and it's always trying to help you to survive and thrive within your environment and within your social structures. But it's not always right.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be right. The whole point is that it's keeping you from harm. And so we're always dealing with this aspect of ourselves. And this is ultimately the focus of my breathwork philosophy. The language of breath is kind of to stop, torturing ourselves, to stop, to form that better relationship within.
Well, and I want to talk a lot about conscious and unconscious self, and the way you just kind of teased talking about that was, different things land with different people. And so one of either I can look at it as a challenge, a positive or negative challenge, is that I feel like right now I'm charged with helping people understand that they need breath work without them thinking that they need it, right? Because I was a person who didn't think that I needed it. And then I experienced it. And then I was like, well, this makes a big difference, right? We can control our nervous system completely with it. Like we can technically affect this. Now, as an educator, as someone who is teaching, I know that you do teach breathwork to kids. Yeah. I don't know if it's middle school or just high school. So in the vein of this, before we jump back into some of the deeper stuff, if you're teaching middle school or high school kids, what do you jump in first? How do you get their attention to help them think, oh, maybe I'm kind of interested in this? Where would you start before you even get started?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically I will teach high school is the youngest that I usually teach, like in groups. And then beyond that, it would be, okay, could you teach our family, or could you teach, I have a son who, I was just kind of hoping you would check out his breathing and make sure he, so ultimately it doesn't matter. So I've got a 7-year-old boy who I try to, I'm like, okay, you probably won't thank me someday because, well, that's how we are. But, but ultimately I want him to grow up, and I want him to understand himself in a way that I didn't for the longest time. There was nothing wrong with me. It's just that I didn't understand what was going on. And so I made bad decisions. So, but the question is important, because how do you get buy-in, right? And so for high schoolers, and just really for all humans, really, right? For all humans, you have to have the why. You have to have a reason why you're going to at least give it a chance. And that, as long as you have that, then ultimately there's a tradition of breathwork that just says willingness is enough. And if you can get the willingness, everything else will follow. Now, how do you get willingness, especially with young people? So with high school students, ideally, you get to know the student as a person. We often want to have kind of a blanket thing. And that led to, I remember when I was in high school, I was like, hey, school's cool. And nothing's more of a turn off than it's like, okay, you're not even getting it right. So you want to kind of get to know the person. I would say if you have a high school student or a middle school student who's interested in sports, then you want to go with the sports route. Because every person understands what it's like to be breathless. So you say, okay, what if I told you that we could make it so that you can run faster and for longer, or jump higher, all these things? Would you be interested in something like that? Well, of course, make me into Superman. Let's do this. And so a lot of times for my young people, I usually go with breath work that is more athletically based, because they see the function in it. It's very difficult for an unformed brain to have the introspection to say, I think I'm dealing with something. To have that metacognitive reflection that's not to say that it doesn't happen, because I do have a lot of young people who have that emotional intelligence early on. But when it comes to the why, oftentimes a young person hasn't really had enough experiences to compare it with to say, you know what, I think I'm dealing with social anxiety in an unhealthy way. Are there any alternatives? Now, having said that, I do a full workshop at some places where, especially the high schools that generally have me though, okay, for better or worse, are where the students are very motivated already. And so I would love for it to be taught, I would say, in every part. So elementary, middle, and high school, and expanding as you go. Hey, Okay. So you've got a nervous system. I had, you go to biology class and you kind of silo the information that you learn, sadly enough. And so, yeah, okay, there's this nervous system or whatever. I didn't remember really getting any applicable information when I was in school about, okay, how does this apply to me and how can I have an experience? How can I really experience this? And so explaining, okay, there's two main branches to your autonomic nervous system. Okay. So you've got the active and you've got more relaxed, right? So we might call that the sympathetic dominant from my, hey, if you're listening to a podcast, you're already a nerd. So you're our kind of people, right? So the sympathetic dominant side, the parasympathetic dominant side. Okay. So you've got these. So one's for activation to get you moving around and doing actions. The other one is to help you relax, to help you recover, to heal and digest your food and all of these things that we need to do on a regular basis. So you have these two modes. If I would have known that, I think just knowing that early on, it's like, okay, there's two basic modes. Whenever you're in those two modes, your body expresses itself differently, right? So your blood pressure, your hormones, your ability to digest food, a lot of these things are going to express themselves differently. And stress hormones can cause you to have, poor night's sleep, extra anxiety, and in many cases, acne, a lot of the things that we suffered from when we were younger. And so I would say if they already have an interest, go with that interest. But if they don't, I would say suit it for what they're going through at the time. So for instance, my son is learning, he's 7 years old and, first, second, third grade, humans are dealing with like, if I get upset, what am I supposed to do? Right? Am I supposed to, it's just these simple things. Let's see. I could hit my friend, right? I could cry. I could run away. And so what I teach my son is a little technique. And again, this is for kiddos. Is called Darth Vader breathing. Now you're familiar with this, right? But it's not sniff, sniff, poo. A nice sniff, deep breath, ultimately a deep breath down into the tummy with your nose. And then you know how Darth Vader breathes on the exhales and it makes it kind of fun, right? There needs to be an element of fun, especially when they're little, and say, okay, when you get upset, I want you to breathe like Darth Vader, right? And my son, now everybody's a little different, but my son finds that to be hilarious. And so he, now does he always do it? Maybe, maybe not. Right. But it's something that helps him in those moments. And then of course it diffuses the situation it's like he's being funny and people and so a lot of other kids will do it too. So now you have a bunch of 7-year-olds who would have been fighting all breathing like Darth Vader together, much easier problem to deal with. When they get into, obviously the big thing is like, hey, wait a minute. Puberty is killing me. Right. And so it's easier to say, hey, listen, if you want to be a little bit more relaxed and more confident, you want to be a little more confident. Okay. So you have an active state and a passive state. So what you want to be is somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. I remember just like, man, I just wish I could relax, but I can't. Okay. So then, we might do like the physiological sigh or a sniff, sniff, poo type of a thing. So again, I wish I could give everyone an audio of that. So the name, I gave it the name. I like
it. I like all these names. Let's go through all your breathwork names, Jesse.
I love using like things that kind of like exemplify, it makes it simple. I actually didn't give it the name Sniff Sniff Poo. I heard it from another breathworker somewhere a long time ago, but that one was like, yeah, I'm using that one. Mm-hmm. But Sniff Sniff Poo is your first inhale is about 75% through the nose. And then you fill up the rest of the way with the next sniff. And then you just relax the exhale with a P sound. You're making a poo. It's lengthening the exhale as long as you can. So sniff, sniff, right? And of course, you probably.
Oh, you really are saying poo. I always thought you said poof with an F on the end, but your mic was blocking it off. But even funnier for kids.
Exactly. So I think the biggest thing is, so breath work, meditation, a lot of this stuff, we have to think about our audience. And when it comes to breath work, there's a lot of garbage out there. So we have what I call, at least, the clickbait garbage, which is, hey, one simple trick and it'll fix you for life, or all these things where it's like, hey, I don't have any stress anymore because I learned this simple technique. And there's no technique that will make life without stress, because that is part of being a human. So when you read those headlines, just don't click. I mean, that's all it is clickbait. And then there are, in breath work, there's some like schools where it just has to be one. This is our only way of doing it. And maybe the technique is fantastic, but it's the only way. Don't look at anywhere else. But ultimately, and this is where my whole philosophy comes from, is like, you've got to think about, it's ultimately a way of communicating within yourself. And that's the crux of it, because a part of you is trying to help you, but it's causing you discomfort. So this thing we call anxiety. Mm-hmm. And the stress response, right? That feeling that we all hate or love. I mean, adrenaline junkies are real. I mean, it is a thing, to be an adrenaline addict.
You have your own definition for anxiety. I don't know if it's your definition, but I wrote it down from last time I heard you talk about it. Tell me how you define it.
So, well, it's interesting. So anxiety, of course, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, right? There's the English professor in me, right? So anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And I always love that, because you have optionality, but it's like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Right? Now, the biological feeling of anxiety, it's interesting. So there's a part of your brain called the locus coeruleus. And when you are in states where, at least unconsciously, the part of your unconscious. So when I say unconscious, I don't mean you're asleep or passed out. I mean, right now, currently, all of us are taking in about 11,000 pieces of information per second. We can only consciously use and process about 40 to 50 pieces of information. The rest of that is processed by what in some circles they call the adaptive unconscious. It's a part of ourselves. It's everything from your limbic system, the subconscious area, right? Your brainstem, all these things that are there behind the scenes, so to speak. Well, that is processing an enormous amount of information that you're not really aware of. We're just not aware of this. But when it decides that, okay, based on the patterns of my life that I've seen thus far in my life, I believe that this is going to be a potentially dangerous situation, or that I need to activate myself in some way. Okay. And you got to remember, all this is very primal. We're a hunter-gatherer society for most of human history. We've only been modern, for maybe 150 years. Well, that part of you is going to say, okay, so we need to activate, and it will start activating your nervous system, and your sympathetic dominant side will become more active. So you'll start having more stress hormones. But what happens is, it's so interesting. It will give you dopamine, and that's a reward chemical that typically we associate, okay, I'm going to pick up my phone and I'll get a dopamine hit or whatever. But that is a neurochemical that is actually it actually encourages you to action. That's your unconscious saying, go figure something out. Go find out what's going on over there. Go solve the mystery. That's why we love mysteries as humans. I mean, we just have to know. An unsolved mystery is just like, oh man, but what about this? What about this? Right? We love that. And it's built in. That is part of our organism. Well, what happens is, and this is all controlled by a part of your brain called the motivational network. And it's actually the thing that decides what we worry about. You ever notice that we don't really get to decide that? But funny? A part of you does. Yeah.
We think we're so in control. I have to stop and underline a couple of things that you're delving into, because we've talked about them here and there on the podcast. And I just want to make sure, I just want to put these in bold. So we've got our conscious self, unconscious self. And our conscious self is maybe 5% of what actually happens. We think we're in control. And our unconscious self is actually taking in, to quote you, 11,000 pieces of information. It learns patterns quickly. It's automatically working on stuff in the background. It's like, oh, I just keep picking up my phone to check things, right? It's learning this pattern really quickly. And it's what is creating like the internal emotions that we don't even realize sometimes, or we think is really normal. I used to think it was really normal to pit out every time I'd speak in front of people. And I was like, oh, it's fine. You know, it's just how it is. But that was my unconscious self just presenting how it really felt. Right. So
trying to help you.
Yeah. Trying to help. So anyway, back to you. What you were talking about is we don't get to decide the things that create worry in us. Right.
Yeah. And this happens, like, if you think about our ancestors. Okay, so this is fantastic for our survival for the vast majority of human history because, okay, you're out in, you know, on the hunt or out in the wilderness, and, you know, there's so many pieces of information to process. The unconscious self can start to pick up patterns, and suddenly I observe there's a predator or a prey or something like that. And great, that's great. But you know, for us, it's different. Maybe it'll be like 3 a.m. and you wake up in the middle of the night and the thing that didn't bother you whenever you went to bed, somehow you got to solve that mystery. You've got to figure out what so-and-so is going to say the next day. I don't know what my boss is going to say, but your motivational network says, I know what to do. I know what to do. Krista just needs a little bit more dopamine, right? And then eventually you're like, there's nothing I can do. And then your unconscious is like, I know what to do. But it's always living in the present. So it doesn't understand tomorrow, right? And so it says, you know what we'll do? We will release a neurochemical called norepinephrine, and it'll be released globally within your brain from the locus coeruleus. And what that does is heighten all of your senses. So you can see more sharply. Your sense of smell, it actually increases. You can smell more sharply. Hearing, all your tactile senses are heightened. So you're more sensitive in every single way. And for our ancestors, this was great, right? Because if we were hunting, if we were gathering, we want to see the predator before it sees us. We want to hear it before it hears us, smell it before it smells us. That was awesome then. But here we are in our bed at 3 a.m, like just freaking out. Like, it's like, oh my God, everything's just kind of coming in. And that is ultimately what we know as the modern condition of anxiety. It is a mismatch between our actual circumstances and our unconscious self trying to help us. So we will have anxiety, which is ultimately the unconscious part of you trying to activate. Because you got to remember, most of our human history, if you had a problem, there was a physical action you could take to solve that problem. It's not that way anymore, and everything's more complex. And so we're actually experiencing what our organism is trying to do is help us. It's trying to say, okay, fine, here we go. You've got all the materials you need to, you know, not get eaten by the jungle cat. But it's a different world. And so this mismatch, you know, I always say that we are a relationship within ourselves, and we're a relationship with the rest of the world outside of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's a mismatch we have, is those relationships. There's a mismatch in it, and it causes us anxiety, and it can lead to a lot of suffering.
Yeah. Okay. So we have an imbalance in our conscious self and unconscious self, right? We can name them. Right. Or yours named, Jesse.
Yeah.
What are they named?
So the conscious self and the unconscious self. Yeah, ultimately, there's.
Oh, I thought you gave them personas. That's what I meant. Like,
oh yeah. There's conscious Jesse and unconscious Jesse. I have an exercise that I often will lead people in, and it is simply just close your eyes and then just picture a smiling you, smiling right back at yourself, and it's saying, "Hey, I'm just trying to help you, right? I'm here. I'm your best friend." And, you know, I've had best friends that will try to help me. And then I'm like, I really wish you weren't trying to help me right now. It's kind of making things worse. And we're never not going to have that relationship, right? So
I know everything about you.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. And this is an interesting relationship, right? So you have a relationship with yourself, and no one knows you better than yourself. And the unconscious you is where, I mean, that's where your personality resides. That's where your sense of humor resides. All of the things. I mean, it's really an interesting thing, and it never turns off. The conscious you can turn off, but the unconscious you will not turn off. Mm-hmm. That's why, like, for instance, that's why optical illusions, some of them, yeah, you know, the one where they have the 2 lines, and then the arrows that are pointing out and the arrows are pointing in. And you're like, I've seen this trick before, so I know they're the same length, but it still looks like one is longer than the other. That's because the unconscious you doesn't stop, and you can't consciously tell it not to. It's why alarm clocks work. It never goes to sleep. It's always listening. It's always trying to help you, but it's not always right. And so this is where breathwork can play, because using our breath, we can actually communicate with that part of ourselves in a way that we could not otherwise. You can't consciously think, I think we've all tried this, right? Relax.
Right.
Just like think, relax. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work. So
yeah, we can't think our heart rate differently. Can't think it into it. Well, I mean, it's funny though. We can think it into elevating, right? We can think it into elevating, but the reverse is different.
Technically, you can do both, but it's really hard to make that happen. People that are champion meditators and things like that can accomplish that, after, a decade.
Not a champion meditator, right?
I'm not a champion meditator, right? Mm-hmm. And the good news is that you don't have to have, actually recently was shown in research that breath offers more release and relief from anxiety and stress than meditation and mindfulness. So you don't have to do those things. I still recommend doing them, but breathwork offers us a way to speak to that part of ourselves in a really focused way that is, and then when you learn how that language works, you can actually start to hear, oh, okay, message received. Oh, wow. Okay. And you can really have an amazing relationship within yourself.
It's reasonable to say that if we're feeling a little out of sorts, out of alignment, just kind of maybe unfulfilled is not the right word, but just kind of funky, right? That examining relationship with self is a reasonable place to start, because that's going to mirror our relationship with the outside world.
Absolutely.
Before we get into, I want to talk just through some different breathwork tools. And I mean, you already talked about Darth Vader, and you talked about sniff too. I have a couple more questions about that. Before we do, you touched on this just a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about our addiction to dopamine and how our brain is constantly looking for this hit? Because sometimes, I don't know about you, but for me, I always like to understand self. And that's what we've been talking all about. And so I feel like when we understand how our brain is wired to crave this, it's helpful in breaking the loop and the pattern.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of senses that help us orientate ourselves. So for instance, we have a sense of proprioception. So for those of you guys listening or watching, if you close your eyes, your body doesn't disappear, right? You know where you are. You can feel where you are. You can feel how you feel, right? You can see, there's a lot of senses that will tell us things. We don't have a way of understanding the quality of information that we're getting, or the quality of nutrition that we're getting. Like you can't taste something. If it tastes kind of earthy, you might say, oh, it probably has vitamins in it, but that's a guess, right? We don't have any sensors that are directly related to the quality of anything that comes into our minds or our bodies for the most part, especially when it comes to information. And you have to understand, information is something that we have so much more of now than we've ever had. It's been estimated that the average person living today ingests more information in one day than the average person did before 1850 for their entire lives. I mean, just insane. Now, dopamine is a neurochemical that has served our species very well. And it's the reason why we were able to circumnavigate the globe. It's what helps us to eliminate uncertainty that can cause us harm. It's the thing that, for instance, it's the thing at nighttime. I don't know if you're like me, but you lay down in bed and you're like, did I lock the doors? And it won't let you go to sleep until you know for sure, because it's there to help you eliminate uncertainties that might hurt you. And then it's also there to help you to discover new opportunities that could help you. So those are the two basic functions, right? And to explore your surroundings is to do that because, well, maybe there's fertile, hunting grounds over here, or maybe there's another tribe and we could find a partner that's outside of this tribe because, man, they've all been taken, right? And so for the longest time, our dopamine systems were not stimulated as hard because we had fewer uncertainties. We still had a lot of uncertainty, but we didn't have as many. Now, because of the amount of information we receive, and we have no way of knowing if it's good or not, right? We have no way of knowing, is this quality information? Is this true? Well, I have to do a lot of conscious thinking and figure out if it's true. And that's just one piece of information. And we get thousands of pieces of information every day now. So dopamine you'll find that the vast majority of us in the modern world are swimming in dopamine. We have more dopamine in our brains. And then in addition to that, we'll do things like, and hey, I'm not bashing on coffee. I drink it every morning. All right. But that makes us more sensitive to dopamine. That's already in our system. So dopamine feels good. And it also has a very positive function when it's used appropriately. But we also have ways that dopaminergic urge that they've short-circuited the way these things are meant to work. So we have humans have the two major drives. We have a reproductive drive and the dopaminergic drive. And so we've figured out ways to make a shortcut so that you can get the satisfaction a lot faster. It used to be you had to work and toil and just all kinds of stuff in order to get satisfied. But now I can just look here on my cell phone or, there's so many ways that you can satisfy that dopaminergic urge. Now, the urge to check your phone, right? I think most people, whether you admit it or not, before you go to bed, right? Before we go to bed, we look at our phones and we exhaust ourselves looking, okay, check all my socials, check all my emails or whatever. And that's because that's the same thing that our ancestors were doing for their living situation. Okay, I'm going to check to make sure there's no snakes or bears or things like that when I become unconscious. But now, instead of just looking around and saying, okay, it looks pretty safe, now we have an infinite number of possible problems. And it's not even limited to our own surroundings. I know what's going on across the world. I know about climate change. I know about all these things that there's really no way for me to ever, as an individual, completely solve these things. But my dopamine is like, you need to solve those things. Your motivational network is saying, oh yeah, there's a problem. Well, we better figure out the answer. And so we are quite literally swimming in dopamine most of the time. Yes, there are some people who have low amounts of dopamine, but the vast majority of us who have a healthy dopaminergic system probably could deal with unplugging a little bit. We could deal with taking some time out in nature and getting away from all of these information sources, because it's those information sources that we say, okay, well, I'm just going to watch the next story on the news because it might be something important that will be there for my survival or for me to thrive. What is the next bit of information? And there's always a next bit of information now, right? So yeah, the modern person, we have to have ways to break through that dopamine, what I call the dopamine feedback loop in my book, because what happens is there's so many things you can never actually solve, so many uncertainties you can never cover, so many places that are, at least now, there's not physical places maybe that are uncharted, but there's so many uncharted places, metaphorically and maybe technologically that are uncharted, that if you just constantly follow your dopamine, you'll never rest. You'll never have any real peace. So this is where breathwork can be a huge, huge help just to break that cycle, to break through that dopamine feedback loop that we, as modern humans, tend to suffer from.
Let's talk about some types of breath work. Let me start with one that you mentioned, but we didn't talk more about.
Yeah.
You may have left us with question marks. You said, sometimes with kids, if I want to pique their interest, run fast or whatever, we'll do some athletically based breath work.
Yeah.
What does that look like? Or how would you define that? What does that mean?
So the three major, schools of breathwork, the three major types, one would be functional breathwork, and then another would be more of the autonomic nervous system regulation, physiological changes. And then the last one would be integrative breathwork, like theta breathing, right? And so what I would do with the athletes is go over functional breathing. So the actual act of breathing. So the average athlete, they did some research on college athletes recently, and it came back that 90% of college athletes, and we're talking about healthy people, have dysfunctional breathing patterns. Simply having a dysfunctional breathing pattern, even when you're just sitting around, even when you're asleep, it can put you in a chronically high stress state. And so I cover a lot of, okay, this is how you're supposed to be breathing. And we undo a lot of dysfunction. And then in addition to that, we will do hypoxic training. So when you are hypoxic, you have low blood oxygen saturation. There are techniques that you can use that will allow you to do that intermittently. If you had low oxygen saturation long term, that would be a bad thing. But whenever we do certain techniques, we can reduce your blood oxygen saturation low enough and short, just long enough that your body will produce EPO, which will then produce more red blood cells, which increases your oxygen carrying capacity. That's what athletes do when they do altitude training. And then we also want to address their CO2 tolerance. So CO2 being the molecule that whenever it is elevated or whenever there's a certain level of it, it causes you to have the urge to breathe. It's incredible what we can do when we make friends with that. And it's uncomfortable. No one likes it, but it's something that it can really open up the range of athletic performance in ways that very few other styles of breathwork can. So we work with those things. We want to have functional breathing. We want to have a healthy CO2 tolerance, and we want to be able to carry as much oxygen in our blood as we can.
This was helpful for you to talk about the schools of thought around this, because if I learned this, it didn't stick for me before, but I had taken a course in functional breathwork from a physical therapist, and it was all about that, right? It was all about functional breath. Whereas, I just finished that's how I met you, is with the theta breathwork certification. That's integrative.
Right.
The third one is autonomic, you said? Did I make?
Right.
So tell us what that looks like.
So really, when it comes down to it, everything breath is going to have some kind of an influence on your autonomic nervous system. So every breath you take, whether you mean to do it or not, it's either influenced by or it's influencing your nervous system via that pathway. Like, for instance, when I train police officers, firefighters, EMTs, military, we focus a lot on autonomic nervous system because we understand that typically there's a lot of research that shows when you're in a heightened state of sympathetic dominance. And this is when we might call it fight or flight. And when you get even more stimulated, you would maybe say fight, flight, freeze, right? Well, we can't have people who are in charge of, helping people in a burning house freezing or making dumb decisions and I will say dumb decisions because it's also shown that the more stressed that we become, the more heightened our anxiety is, whether it's whatever reason, we tend to have a lower amount of cognitive power. So our cognition reduces dramatically as we become more stressed. So with especially that group, and of course, athletes are the same way. We're all the same way. When I train CEOs and all these things, they want to make better decisions. So, okay, we have to make sure that we're not heightened. Yes, you want to be activated. Of course, if you're an athlete or if you're running in to save people, it's not like you're going to take a nap. But we want to make sure to be really careful, and so we can throttle that. So we're making good decisions because, if you're the person in charge, you got to be performing in every way. So when it comes to autonomic nervous system protocols, in the language of breath, we do all three of these things, by the way, because all three of them are really interconnected. And so what I've done with the language of breath, I tried to have like a unified theory of all breath work, just really try to bring it all together. But when we look at the autonomic nervous system, that's oftentimes I like to call it the Rosetta Stone of breath work and your nervous system. And it ultimately allows you to say, okay, these things in my physiology are manifesting in this way. Wow, I must really be activated, or maybe I'm not so much. And so I train people, first of all, with, simple things like heart rate or, check to see where this is and, how does this feel? And then ultimately we graduate to really work with that sense of interoception. And for those if you've not heard that word before, that interoception is our ability it's ultimately our sense of internal awareness. And once you can become really in tune with that, then you're listening to your partner, right? That's that unconscious self. It's going to manifest its way in sensations and changes in physiology and heart rate changes, breathing changes, all sorts of things. And the more you get in touch with that in a real educated way, it's, okay, I know what this is and why this is doing this. Then you can really just, I've got a great relationship. And my unconscious it's upset or it's telling me this, but okay, my conscious self understands the situation and I'm going to speak back to that. And so that way we're having that positive relationship within ourselves. So we do that with autonomic nervous system protocols. We can do it with other things, but generally when you think breathing technique, I like to say in the language of breath, that's a phrase to speak to the unconscious self to say, okay, should we calm down? Should we activate? Should we stay in kind of like a playful mode? Where should we be?
Yeah. I have two more things that I think would be of service. One is, again, our brains just like to see proof, right?
Yes.
Probably part of the dopaminergic
of course, yeah.
urge here. So tell me one or two stories, or maybe even three, or tell me about some cool things that you've seen as a result of doing, or people doing breath work. Like, what are some things that you're like, wow, that is so cool.
Yeah.
I love my job.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that I've seen, I was talking about first responders, so that's the first thing that comes to mind. I do a retreat each year for first responders in the Midwest. It's called the Great Midwestern Reset. This year it's in May. So 2023, it's in May. And I go over all three of these things. It's a deep dive in the language of breath. And I had an officer who, when we went through functional breathing, I got to her because I check everybody out. And she says, she kind of with a scared look in her face, I don't think I'm activating my diaphragm at all. I don't think I can. And sure enough, she was really struggling. That's a primary breathing muscle that is fundamental to proper breathing and to so much when it comes to how you're speaking to your unconscious. She was breathing heavily in her shoulders and her upper chest. And, not to go on and on about that, but that's ultimately a way of sending a stress message. So if you're staying in that top part of your breath wave, that's generally going to send the stress message. Now, you got to remember, this woman was a police officer in her beat for the longest years was is like very, very high violence area. She had been, I know she'd had multiple times where, thank God she was wearing that vest, right? So this is a person who's had a lot of stress just on a regular daily basis. It's a person who is in a chronic state, right, of stress and what they call hypervigilance, especially in this field. And it had really had a huge effect on her natural breathing. Well, she was at this retreat because she's like, I've got to have something. Something's got to change. I know that I've got a lot of the symptoms of PTSD. I've got a lot of the symptoms of, what they call hypervigilance, which ultimately leads to so many negative consequences. And so gave her a smile and said, hey, this is okay. Guided her through some basic exercises to help reactivate those muscles. Before she was done with the retreat, she was doing better, but she still had a long way to go. Yeah. And so then later she checked back in with me. Hey, I think I've got this. This is going really well. And she said, you know what? I teach at the police academy and we need this. This has changed my life. I'm sleeping better. My focus is better. I can tell like a noticeable change. And I'm just really blown away at like how something as simple as just where my breath was, like not even really powerful, what we would like in the breathwork world is like life-changing breath, but it was life-changing breathwork. And it was simply functional breathing and a few breathing techniques that she could do functionally. And actually now she was a spearhead at this police academy in Indiana. And now she was like, we need a certification. We need to teach the next generation. And so I developed, thanks to her, I developed a certification just for first responders. And she is going to be in the very first class. This woman who could not, it was really not a thing she was not able to activate her diaphragm, is now not only living better herself, sleeping better, feeling better in every way, but now she's saying, I need to share this with the next generation so that people don't have to suffer the same way I did. So that to me was like, it's such an honor to work with people when not only did it change her life, but now she's trying to help change the lives of her profession. I've had people with phobias. I've worked with people with phobias a lot. Actually, I had a guy who had a phobia. He was a CEO of a online company, big, like really big company. And he had started to develop a phobia of flying. And this is not good when you're a CEO of a company that he has got to fly all over the United States and all over the world. And so he reached out to me and he didn't take it seriously as maybe he should have at first. He's like, yeah, okay, yeah, we'll do this breathing technique and whatever. And didn't really
why did he
practice
reach out to you if he wasn't going to take it seriously? I'm just asked this out of curiosity because I've had people, I mean, this happens to me sometimes too, but.
Yeah. Well, and it's because I think all coaches go through this too, but there's a certain degree of it works when I'm with you. And then when I'm not with you, I just don't think about it anymore. And I go about my regular life. And then I'll see you next week whenever it'll work again. And then we're human beings. We have to have a lot of compassion for ourselves because we're all liable to do this now and then. And it's something where it's like, okay, now you fixed me, right? Or, it's this thing where maybe sometimes they're dependent on the coach to make sure I'm doing it right. And by myself, I don't necessarily feel comfortable doing it. Or it's just a matter of fitting it into our lives. There's, we've all got our hangups.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't know what his hangup was necessarily. This has been quite a few years ago, but he was always beating himself up whenever we got on the next call. He's like, I didn't do my homework. And I'm like, it's okay. But I mean, it is your practice. It's not me. Well, one time he got on a plane and he hadn't been doing his homework and he started to notice he felt the anxiety come up and he tried to do a technique that is good for going to sleep, which is the worst thing you can try to do when you're in a heightened state. Like you're starting to hyperventilate. Well, hey, let's breathe in for 4 seconds, out for 8 seconds. Let's try that, right? A 12-second breath. And so he just had the worst flight ever. And then he came back and he said, listen, we need to make this happen. So, yeah. So then we really started working on it. And eventually he was able to fly without hating life. I'm not going to sit here and say, and he was miraculously cured, but he was able to fly without taking whatever drug that he had got prescribed. No, it's Xanax. He was able to not have to take that. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that was a huge win. I had a woman that had a phobia of driving on the highway, especially, and she wanted to take her grandson to the zoo. And so we slowly worked our way to helping her. We went through a lot of techniques, a lot of just grounding, a lot of getting to know your own self, because what happens so often is that we won't be able to, we're not always able to listen to the language that our unconscious is saying until it's screaming at us. And then it's kind of hard to go anywhere from there. So we really worked a lot on awareness, and anyone who works with the language of breath is working a lot with awareness. And everyone wants to skip that part, right? We all want to skip that because it's boring, but that's the foundation of all positive change is ultimately awareness. But yeah, she was able to make it to the zoo with her grandson, and she still doesn't like driving near semis. That still gives her some, she's like, I still don't like doing that. I'm just going to, if there's one on the road and it's going a little slower, I'll just go slow and not pass it. But she wasn't able to drive on the highway. Mm-hmm. And then now she's able to, it's like an hour drive on the highway. Yes, if there's a semi, she's just going to go behind it. No big deal. I asked her, do you want to work on that? And she's like, you know what? I think I'm okay for now.
I can empathize with her. I was hit by a semi once in high school. Totally should have died. And I was like freaked out for like the moments passing a semi for years afterwards. So I'm sure there was a reason that she had that phobia,
And good for her for saying, you know what? I've found a place where I'm comfortable and I'm going to celebrate that victory. And, if she wants to work on that in the future, she can. But wow, what an accomplishment. Not being able to drive on the highway at all. Now able to drive on the highway for an hour and maybe go a little slower than the semi. But it's not like she's just, going 40 miles an hour on the shoulder. She's doing just fine. And so I always hate when people act like breath work is some kind of magic. It's like a magical cure. You do need to do the work. And you do need to be aware of yourself and understand that parts of you are going to protest, especially whenever it's behavior changes. They're going to protest. They're going to say, this is not what we do. We can't do this. This is going to hurt. This is going to kill me. And it's going to be uncomfortable. But when you're willing to do the work, breath work can do things that other things just can't do. And that's the beauty of it.
Mm-hmm. If I think this is the best place to end, which is people are always like, okay, cool, Jesse, you've shared some interesting things, but I'm not exactly sure how I want to get started. Or what would you recommend to someone for just like exploring this a little bit?
So there's a few things. Of course, I would recommend my book. It's a practical guide to breath work. I give you my story. I give you kind of like an explanation as far as what's going on with the nervous system. And then there's like 20 techniques, maybe more. I forget how many. There's a lot of the second half of the book is techniques. So if you want to experiment with that, that's a great place to start. I also have an online course and a miniature online course of the language of breath. So my full deep dive course is 7 weeks. It's an hour a week. I mean, we're talking like you're going to be a pro by the time you're done, but maybe you're like, I just want to kind of dip my toes. I've got a 1-hour course. It's called The Foundations of the Language of Breath. It's only $50 and it's on my website, jessecoomer.com, and you can find it there. Those are some resources but if you want to get past the clickbait, just one simple trick, the Google search, what's a breathing technique for this, right? If you want to actually make the changes that you really want to see and you want to take it seriously, those are resources that I worked very hard to produce. And the good news is I've got a lot of satisfied reviews. So those are the resources that I've got for you. And of course, if you can attend a deep dive, like a retreat or something like that with a qualified breath worker, whether it's myself or not, those are great ways to get started.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I was going to ask you where people can find you online, but it's jessecoomer.com. Anywhere else?
jessecoomer.com. You can also go to languageofbreathcollective.com. And that is if you'd like to even train to become a breath worker, I have a class every year. This class for 2023 is already full, but we'll be taking enrollments for 2024 in the near future. And then you can always find me on the old Instagram. Jesse Coomer Breath is my handle. And you can find out what kind of antics I'm up to. Warning, there's dad jokes a lot of times out there. But yeah, always a good place to find out what I'm up to.
Perfect. Thanks so much for coming on today.
It's been a pleasure.
Food sensitivities, low energy, and skin issues can all be caused by inflammation. The root cause of inflammation is immune system imbalance. So how do you bring the immune system into balance to correct inflammatory symptoms like food sensitivities, low energy, skin issues, and a cascade of other things no one seems to have the answer to, like being sick more often than you should be, having consistently low vitamin D, B12, iron, salt and or sugar cravings, puffiness in your face or extremities, needing a daily antihistamine, losing hair but your labs are normal? The answer to these things is immune resilience, and that's the overarching goal I have when working with one-on-one clients. So how could I help? Well, I found that you want the answer to everything, so I try to be as comprehensive as possible to be a one-stop shop. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to focus on weight loss because I'm not, but I will focus on the subclinical things that are often preventing weight loss or causing resistance, just for example. But big picture, I love helping people with these nitty-gritty weird symptoms that are falling through the cracks everywhere else under that inflammatory umbrella. I want to help you with as much as possible in the time we have together. So I try to include everything I need to do that, or I'm transparent about what I don't include. So what I usually include are a couple of labs, both gut and nutrient labs. You can always add on more if you want or if it's needed, but I try to keep it streamlined and efficient to start. I also include one-on-one interpretation and step-by-step personalized protocols. We will tell you exactly what to do and what you can expect for results and timelines. And support between appointments, I have weekly office hours, messaging, and training so you can understand the basics and ask advanced questions in our face-to-face time. You're welcome to take as much or as little as you want. You can think of it like an all-you-can-eat buffet, but you can graze here or there as needed as you need support between appointments. And if we don't hear from you, we'll even check in to make sure things are going okay and that things aren't falling through the cracks. If you're a past client and if you're needed anything, you're welcome to book a call too if it's been more than a year since I've seen you. And if I need a context of anything that's going on with you right now, I am taking clients currently the last time until fall. So right now I'm accepting calls. We'll ship out our testing or your testing in May and really get started in June. So if you want to maximize this season and bring your body into balance, you can go to kristabigler.com or check the show notes and click on that program page to apply and book an intro call. Sharing and reviewing this podcast is the best way to help us succeed with our mission to help integrate the best of East and West and empower you to raise the bar on your health story. Just go to review reviewthispodcast.com/less stressed life. That's reviewthispodcast.com/less stressed life. And you'll be taken directly to a page where you can insert your review and hit post.